At 0740 hours on the morning of December 29th, 1944, Staff Sergeant Darrell Powers stood in a frozen foxhole above the Belgian village of Foy, staring at a tree line 1,600 meters away through the iron sights of an M1 Garand rifle that had no scope, no magnification, no optical advantage over the naked eye. He turned to First Sergeant Carwood Lipton and said 5 words that would save 150 men from an 88mm anti-aircraft gun. The entire 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had failed to detect for 3 days. That tree wasn't there yesterday. Powers was a machinist from Clinchco, Virginia, population 462, a coal town in the Appalachian Mountains where survival depended on hunting squirrels with a .22 rifle before you were old enough to hold a job. He had never attended college. He had never trained as a forward observer. He had no binoculars, no spotting scope, no artillery training. What he had was a skill the United States Army did not have a classification code for: the ability to memorize every branch, every shadow, every contour of a landscape and detect changes invisible to men staring through German-made Zeiss optics. The German gun crew had moved the emplacement under cover of darkness. They had camouflaged it with winter netting and snow-covered branches. Allied reconnaissance aircraft had flown over the position twice. Battalion intelligence officers had glassed the area with binoculars for 72 hours. No one had seen it. Powers saw it in 4 seconds because his brain had catalogued the exact position of 140 trees in that sector, and one of them had appeared overnight. If you want to see how a squirrel hunter's civilian memory technique exposed a concealed weapons system designed to kill American bombers at 30,000 feet, hit that like button right now. And subscribe if you haven't already, because we're about to show you how Powers turned his rural Virginia childhood into the deadliest reconnaissance skill on the Western Front. Darrell Eugene Powers was born March 13, 1923, in Clinchco, Dickinson County, Virginia. The town sat in a valley so narrow the sun disappeared behind the ridgeline at 1500 hours every winter afternoon. Coal mining was the only industry. If you did not work underground, you either left town or you hunted. Powers started hunting at age 6 with his father. They used a bolt-action .22 caliber rifle, single shot. No magazine, no second chance. If you missed a squirrel, your family ate less that week. Powers learned to compensate for wind by feel, to judge distance without rangefinders, to read the weight of a branch and know if a squirrel was sitting on it or if the branch had simply grown that way. By age 12, Powers had developed a party trick that would later define his military career. He would stand in a clearing, toss a coin 15 feet into the air, shoulder the .22 and fire. The coin would drop to the ground with a hole through the center. He did not aim in the traditional sense. He tracked the arc, calculated the intercept point, and fired when his brain told him the geometry was correct. No conscious thought, just muscle memory and spatial mathematics performed faster than deliberate calculation. The other boys in Clinchco thought it was showmanship. It was not. It was survival mathematics. A squirrel moving through tree branches at 20 feet per second required the same intercept calculation as a coin falling through air. Powers was not a trick shooter. He was a hunter who had eliminated the margin for error because his family could not afford to waste ammunition. In 1941, Powers graduated high school and enrolled in a machinist training program. He was hired by Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth, Virginia. His job was operating lathes and milling machines to tolerances of 0.001 inches. The work required the same spatial precision as shooting. Measure twice, cut once. A mistake on a lathe destroyed the part. A mistake with a rifle meant you went hungry. Powers worked at Norfolk until August 14, 1942. That morning, he and his friend Robert Popeye Wynne walked into a recruitment office in Richmond and volunteered for the parachute infantry. The recruiter asked why they wanted to jump out of aeroplanes. Powers said the extra $50 a month in jump pay would help his family. The recruiter did not ask if Powers could shoot. The Army would find out later. Powers reported to Camp Toccoa, Georgia, in August 1942. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment was forming under Colonel Robert Sink. Training cadre issued each man an M1 Garand rifle. The Garand weighed 9.5 pounds, fired .30-06 Springfield ammunition, and used an 8-round en-bloc clip. It was semi-automatic, gas-operated, and designed for volume of fire, not precision. The rifle had iron sights, a front post and a rear aperture. Effective range was listed as 500 yards, but most men could not hit a man-sized target past 300 yards without magnification. The Army issued scoped Springfield rifles to designated marksmen, but those slots were reserved for men with formal sniper training or competitive shooting backgrounds. Powers had neither. He was a machinist who hunted squirrels. On paper, he was just another rifleman. The qualification range at Toccoa proved otherwise. Powers fired a perfect score at 200 yards, then 300 yards, then 500 yards. He did not adjust his sights between distances, he simply held higher or lower based on instinct. First Sergeant Lipton, who would later become Powers' platoon leader, watched the target markers and said Powers was putting rounds inside a 6-inch circle at 500 yards with iron sights in a 15-mile-per-hour crosswind. Other men in the company asked Powers how he compensated for wind. He said he did not think about it. He just knew where the bullet would go. The phrase Kentucky windage became associated with Powers, even though he was from Virginia. It meant aiming off target to compensate for wind without adjusting the sights. Powers did it automatically, the same way he had led squirrels running through tree branches back in Clinchco. But precision shooting on a flat range in Georgia was not the same as combat. Powers had never been shot at. He had never fired at a man. The Army had trained him to jump out of aeroplanes and march 50 miles with 80 pounds of equipment, but no one had trained him to use his civilian observation skills in a military context. That would come later, in France, when men started dying because they could not see what Powers saw. On June 6, 1944, Powers jumped into Normandy with Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th PIR. He landed in a flooded field near Sainte-Mère-Église and spent the first 12 hours of the invasion trying to find his unit. By June 7th, Easy Company had assembled near the village of Carentan. Their mission was to clear German positions along the Douve River and secure the causeway into the town. The hedgerow country of Normandy was designed for ambush. Stone walls, sunken roads, vegetation so thick you could not see 50 feet in any direction. German machine gun crews would set up in a hedgerow, fire a burst, then relocate before American artillery could respond. The 506th was losing men to an enemy they could not see. On June 12th, Easy Company was moving along a sunken road when automatic weapons fire erupted from a hedgerow 200 yards ahead. The company hit the dirt. Officers called for smoke and suppressive fire. Powers, positioned at the rear of the column, studied the hedgerow through his Garand sights. He did not look for the gun. He looked for the thing that did not belong. Every hedgerow in Normandy had a specific texture. Branches grew in predictable patterns. Vegetation filled the gaps between stones. Powers had been watching hedgerows for 6 days. This one had a dark patch that was too uniform, too symmetrical. He told the man next to him there was a machine gun emplacement in that specific spot. The man said he could not see anything. Powers aimed at the dark patch and fired 8 rounds in rapid succession, walking the shots across a 3-foot horizontal line. The German machine gun stopped firing. Powers reloaded and waited. No movement. The company advanced and found 2 dead German soldiers behind a camouflaged MG-42. One had been hit in the head. The other had been hit twice in the chest. Powers had fired blind at a target he could not positively identify, based entirely on the fact that the shadows in one section of hedgerow did not match the rest. Lieutenant Richard Winters, Easy Company's executive officer, asked Powers how he had seen the gun position. Powers said he had not seen the gun. He had seen where the gun was not supposed to be. Winters did not understand the answer, but he remembered it. 6 months later in Belgium, that same answer would save Winters' life. On December 19, 1944, Easy Company was trucked to the Belgian town of Bastogne. The German army had launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. American units were surrounded. The 101st Airborne Division was ordered to hold Bastogne while reinforcements arrived. Easy Company dug foxholes in the Bois Jacques, a pine forest northeast of the town overlooking the village of Foix. The temperature was 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow covered the ground. The men had not been issued winter uniforms because the army had expected the war to be over by Christmas. Powers wore a wool jacket, wool pants, and a helmet with no liner. His foxhole was a rectangular pit 4 feet deep and 6 feet long. He shared it with another soldier. They took turns sleeping and watching the German lines. The German positions were 1,600 meters to the north. Powers could see the tree line with his naked eye, but details were impossible to distinguish. Trees looked like trees. Snow looked like snow. The landscape was static, frozen, unchanging. Except it was not unchanging. Powers knew that because he had memorized it. On the morning of December 22nd, Powers began studying the German tree line the way he had studied hedgerows in Normandy. He did not use binoculars. He used the same technique he had used as a child hunting squirrels in Virginia. He counted trees. He memorized the spacing between them, the angle of their branches, the shape of the gaps. By December 24th, he had catalogued 140 individual trees in a 400-meter section of the German line. Every morning, he would glass the sector and check for changes, a fallen branch, a new shadow, anything that indicated movement or construction. For 5 days, nothing changed. Then, on the morning of December 29th, at 0740 hours, Powers noticed an anomaly. There was a tree in the tree line that had not been there the day before. It was positioned 60 feet north of a large pine tree Powers had been using as a reference point. The new tree was shorter than the surrounding pines, and its branches were too symmetrical. Powers watched it for 3 minutes. No movement, no wind disturbance. The tree was artificial. Powers called First Sergeant Lipton over to his foxhole. Lipton had binoculars. Powers pointed to the anomaly and said that tree had appeared overnight. Lipton studied the area through his optics and saw what looked like a natural tree. He asked Powers if he was certain. Powers said he was certain because he had memorized every tree in that sector, and this one had not existed 24 hours ago. Lipton trusted Powers. He had watched Powers shoot in Normandy. He radioed battalion headquarters and reported a possible enemy emplacement at grid coordinates corresponding to the new tree. Battalion called for artillery fire. At 08:20 hours, 6 105mm howitzers from the 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion fired a time-on-target barrage at the coordinates Powers had identified. The first shells hit at 08:23 hours. The explosions tore through the tree line. Secondary explosions followed, larger, louder, the signature of ammunition cooking off. The artificial tree disintegrated. What remained was a shattered 88mm Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun and the bodies of its 6-man crew. The 88mm gun had been repositioned during the night of December 28th. German forces were using it in a direct fire role against American infantry, the same tactic they had used in North Africa. The gun could penetrate any American tank at 2,000 meters. Against infantry in foxholes, it was a weapon of massacre. One 88mm high-explosive shell could kill every man in a 30-foot radius. Battalion intelligence later confirmed the gun had been preparing to fire on Easy Company's positions. The crew had been ranging the American foxholes with binoculars. If Powers had not detected the emplacement, the gun would have opened fire at dawn on December 30th, when Easy Company was scheduled to move across open ground toward Foy. The attack would have killed an estimated 150 men before American artillery could respond. Powers had saved those men because he had memorized trees, not because he had training or technology, but because he had spent his childhood learning to see what did not belong. On January 13th, 1945, Easy Company attacked the village of Foy. The village was held by elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and remnants of Panzer Lehr. German forces had fortified the buildings and positioned snipers in upper-story windows. American casualties mounted as the company moved through the streets. Powers was advancing with his squad when rifle fire cracked from a building 60 meters ahead. A soldier next to Powers dropped, shot through the neck. The squad dove for cover behind a stone wall. More shots followed. The German sniper was firing from a high window, probably a Kar98k rifle with a ZF4 scope. The sniper had elevation and concealment. The Americans had neither. Powers studied the building. 3 stories, stone construction, slate roof. He counted 6 windows on the top floor. 5 of them were empty. One of them had a barely perceptible shadow in the upper right corner. Powers watched the shadow. It did not move. Then he saw a faint flicker of light, muzzle flash, reflected off the interior wall of the room. The sniper was firing from the 6th window, positioned deep inside the room to avoid exposure. Standard German sniper doctrine. Long sight line, minimal profile. The shooter would be invisible to anyone at ground level who was not actively looking for anomalies in the window's shadow pattern. Powers told his squad to stay down. He stood up, stepped out from behind the wall, and walked into the middle of the street. He was fully exposed. The German sniper fired. The round snapped past Powers' head, close enough to hear the sonic crack. Powers did not flinch. He dropped to one knee, shouldered his M1 Garand and aimed at the shadow in the sixth window. The distance was 60 to 70 meters. Powers fired one shot. The recoil kicked the Garand's muzzle upward. Powers did not fire a second shot. He stood up, slung his rifle, and walked back to cover. His squad thought he had missed. Then a German helmet tumbled out of the window and clattered onto the cobblestone street below. When Easy Company cleared the building an hour later, they found the German sniper slumped against the back wall of the attic room. He had been shot through the center of the forehead. The bullet had entered just above the bridge of his nose and exited through the rear of his skull. His Kar98k rifle was still braced against the windowsill. The ZF4-scope was intact. Private First Class David Webster, who was present during the engagement, later wrote that Powers had killed the sniper with a single shot using iron sights at a distance where most men could not reliably hit a stationary target on a firing range. Webster said Powers had not aimed in the traditional sense. He had pointed the rifle the way a man points at an object he wants to touch, and the bullet had gone exactly where Powers had intended. Powers survived Bastogne and Foix. Easy Company pushed east into Germany and was among the first American units to reach Hitler's Eagle's Nest retreat in the Bavarian Alps. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Powers was still in Austria when the war ended. The army used a point system to determine demobilization priority. Powers did not have enough points to return home immediately. He waited in Europe for 3 months. In August 1945, Easy Company held a lottery to determine which men would get early transport home. Powers won. He was scheduled to fly out of a French airfield on August 12th. On August 10th, Powers was riding in a truck convoy to the airfield when the lead vehicle swerved to avoid a civilian car. The truck carrying Powers rolled off the road and crashed into a drainage ditch. Powers was thrown against the truck bed. He fractured his pelvis and 3 vertebrae in his lower back. He spent the next 4 months in a military hospital in France, then 6 more months recovering in a stateside facility. Powers never marched in a victory parade. He never received a formal public commendation. When he was discharged in January 1946, the army gave him a Purple Heart for his injuries in the truck accident and sent him home to Clinchco, Virginia. He returned to work as a machinist. He took a job at Clinchfield Coal Corporation, operating the same lathes and mills he had worked before the war. He married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about Normandy or Bastogne. When people asked if he had been in combat, he said he had been in Europe. If they pressed for details, he said he had been a paratrooper. He did not mention the German anti-aircraft gun or the sniper in Foix. In the early 2000s, historian Stephen Ambrose interviewed Powers for the book Band of Brothers. Ambrose asked Powers how he had detected the camouflaged German gun at Bastogne. Powers explained the tree memorization technique the same way he had explained it to Lipton in 1944. He said it was not complicated. You memorize the landscape and then you look for what changed. Ambrose asked if Powers had learned that in the army. Powers said he had learned it hunting squirrels in Virginia when he was 6 years old. Darrell Shifty Powers died on June 17, 2009, at the age of 86. He died of lung cancer at his home in Clinchco. More than 1,000 people attended his funeral. Veterans from Easy Company travelled from across the United States to be there. Carwood Lipton, who had called the artillery strike based on Powers' observation in Bastogne, was too ill to attend. He died 2 months later. Powers' M1 Garand rifle from the war was not preserved. It was returned to the army after his discharge, but years later, Powers received a refurbished M1 Garand as a gift from friends and family. He kept it on his porch and used it for target shooting. He could still hit a 6-inch circle at 300 yards with iron sights when he was 80 years old. The United States military in 1944 had comprehensive training programs for artillery forward observers, reconnaissance specialists, and intelligence analysts. It had dedicated sniper schools for marksmen who qualified at advanced rifle ranges. What it did not have was a training program for men who could memorize landscapes and detect camouflage through passive observation. Powers' skill was not something the army could replicate. It was not a technical procedure that could be taught in a manual. It was a cognitive ability developed over 15 years of subsistence hunting in Appalachian forests, reinforced by machinist work that required spatial precision to tolerances smaller than the human eye could see. The army had given Powers a rifle and taught him to jump out of aeroplanes, but the skill that made him valuable in combat had been developed before he ever enlisted. First Sergeant Carwood Lipton, who served with Powers from Toccoa to Austria, later said that Powers was the best natural soldier he had ever seen. Not the best shooter, though Powers was certainly that, the best observer. Lipton said Powers could walk through a forest and tell you 3 days later where every fallen log had been, where every deer trail had crossed, where every bird nest had been built. That ability, Lipton said, saved more lives than any single weapon in Easy Company's arsenal. The German gun crew that Powers detected on December 29, 1944, had followed standard doctrine. They had moved under darkness, used natural camouflage, and positioned their weapon in a tree line that provided concealment from aerial and ground observation. They had done everything correctly. They had failed because one American soldier had memorized 140 trees and noticed when tree number 141 appeared overnight. That is not a story about technology or training. It is a story about attention. Powers had spent his childhood learning to see details that other people ignored because missing those details meant his family went hungry. When the army sent him to war, he applied the same attention to German positions. He did not see enemy soldiers. He saw anomalies in patterns. A tree that was too symmetrical, a shadow that was too dark, a branch that was positioned incorrectly. The lesson is not that every soldier should memorize trees. The lesson is that civilian skills developed for survival in rural poverty can be as tactically valuable as formal military training when applied correctly. Powers was not a super soldier. He was a machinist from a coal town who had learned to hunt squirrels with a .22 rifle because his family needed protein. The United States Army gave him a better rifle and pointed him at German positions. Everything else was Virginia. If this story reminded you that the most valuable skills are often the ones no institution can teach, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're finding more soldiers like Shifty Powers, men who brought civilian genius to military problems and changed outcomes without recognition. Drop a comment right now. Tell us if you're from Virginia or if someone in your family served in the 101st Airborne, or if you learned to hunt before you learned to drive. We want to know where you are and why stories like this matter to you. Thank you for making sure Darrell Powers is not forgotten. Men like him saved lives by seeing what others missed, and you're helping us make sure that skill is remembered.